Welcome to the C Word, the Conservatives podcast. Today we're talking about food. I'm Jenny Mathiasen, an Objects Conservator based in South Yorkshire.
I'm Chloe Rumsey, an Objects Conservator based in Greater Manchester.
And I'm Christina Rizek, an Objects Conservator based in Cambridgeshire.
We've had a lovely email from the Icon Textile Group. They are looking for conference papers, in fact. The deadline is in December, but is likely to extend to January. They're inviting papers and posters from all disciplines of conservation that have ever had an experience with working with textiles and nature. So that's not just textiles as you would normally imagine them. This is for the Spring Forum, which will be held on the 21st of May 2018 in the Museum of London. Presentations should last 20 minutes. Individuals should submit an abstract of no more than 200 words with a title, author biography, and contact details. To submit a proposal or to discuss an idea for a paper, you should email Alison Lister. We will pop a link in the show notes to the page where you can contact her. They're looking for papers and posters of a theoretical or practical nature, either on the specific theme of textiles and nature, or on a general theme of new developments in the interpretation, care, and conservation of textiles. Potential topics for papers include conservation and mounting of items made from materials found in nature, both animal and plant-based, the development of new materials of natural origin, designs and techniques inspired by nature, new insights into the degradation of natural fibres, the care and conservation of textiles and dress featuring natural history specimens, or on taxidermy. I guess you don't have to have taxidermy dressed in something. I think I just made that up, but I got excited anyway. Anyway, if you have any fabulous ideas on these topics, then please check out the link in our show notes and submit a paper. It sounds amazing. And now on to our episode. Right, so we're talking food today. I guess first off, what sort of food have we seen in collections ourselves, if any, indeed?
The museum that I previously worked in had quite a bit of food, actually, relating to sort of exploration visits and things like that. We had a ship's biscuit. We had several tins of food, including my absolute favourite, which is self-heating cocoa in a tin.
How does that work?
What?
Actually, maybe I don't want to know.
It sounds dangerous. The stuff we had was from, I think I'm just looking this up, was from just after the Second World War, but it was quite commonly used in the Second World War as rations for soldiers, so they didn't freeze their arse off while waiting for the Normandy landings or whatever.
Do you stick it in a fire, or is it some sort of exothermic reaction?
No. So the instructions on our tin said self-heating can, instructions for use, shake can, pierce 2 holes in lid, that's underlined because it's really important that you pierce the lid, not the side. Pierce 2 holes in lid above arrows, lever off centre cap, light wick, wait 5 minutes, contents then hot, always pierce can before lighting wick, because clearly the holes are to kind of vent any kind of steam or gases.
Oh, that's cool.
And I think it was common for these things to explode.
I was going to say, does this double as a weapon? So if you don't pierce them, you throw them over the trench and hit a German in the head.
But I just thought that was one of the coolest things I'd seen in a collection, actually. A self-heating tin of cocoa.
And was it used, or was it full of self-heating cocoa?
No, it was, as far as I'm aware, it was full of cocoa, and I guess theoretically we could have pierced the lid and lit the wick inside. But for obvious reasons, we didn't. It was pretty cold in our museum store, but I managed to resist the temptation to have a nice mug of 80-year-old cocoa.
Was it deteriorating in any way that you could tell?
The tin was rusting, but it wasn't. I mean, that's the other thing, actually, about tins. So I worked in a polar museum, and there are people doing a lot of work conserving the tins of food in Antarctica, in the various expedition huts, both the United Kingdom and Antarctic Heritage Trust and also the New Zealand Antarctic Heritage Trust both have conservation projects out on the ice in Antarctica. And quite a lot of that is to do with conserving the food that is out there that is generally, for obvious reasons, quite well preserved, what with very low temperatures being an excellent way of preserving food, and a lot of it was tinned food anyway. But there are cases where they've had to open the tins and remove the contents because the cans had started to bulge alarmingly. Yeah. And you really don't want to kind of leave that stuff there and risk it exploding somewhere.
Speaking of food, personally, I have seen bulging cans and stuff like tin cans, because certainly tinned food is something that I've seen in a lot of collections. Food tends to be left inside. I'm never really entirely sure why. If it's just that's part of the object, or it's just easier to leave it in, or that's someone else's problem in the future. But when they start to go, I have also found post bulging. Oh
no!
So like a nasty carton of something's exploded in here. It's
so gross.
Not great. I've seen, obviously, rations, like we already talked about, more jars, but glass jars, they tend to have different problems. All things do rust through the lid sometimes, depending on if it's pickled stuff inside, for example. It tends to eat through the little jar, like the little jar lid. Spices, powders, the kind of, so like cocoa and coffee and beans and stuff like that. That sort of thing I've certainly come across. And sugar ornaments.
Aww.
At the same museum I was talking about, we also had a piece of wedding cake that belonged to Captain Scott, Robert Scott of the Antarctic.
I have heard quite a lot of different examples of wedding cake in different collections, actually. It seems common. Well, ish.
I mean, I suppose wedding cake is one of those things that traditionally is kept anyway, because at least in the UK, and I don't know if this is different in other countries, but in the UK the traditional wedding cake is a rich fruit cake, which tends to keep very well on its own anyway, and it would normally be covered with marzipan and then with a thick layer of royal icing on top as well, which helps to keep it kind of anoxic and kind of preserve it better.
That, like, Chloe's making slightly enticed noises, and my face is one of horror.
This is one of those things that is completely baffling to anyone who's not British, this love of dried fruit in cakes. No, I realise that from talking to people from elsewhere. But that is the traditional wedding cake, and furthermore, tradition has it that you should keep the top tier of your wedding cake if you have one of these ones that comes in sort of 2, 3, 4 tiers.
I didn't know.
You don't cut it up at the wedding reception. You keep the top tier, and then you have it when your first child is baptised, apparently. We had far too much wedding cake at our wedding, and kept it and just put it in a Stewart box, in a Tupperware box, and forgot about it, and didn't then have a child until more than 5 years later. And he wasn't baptised, but kind of like when he was around 2, we were like, oh yeah, that wedding cake that we completely forgot about, that's in a Tupperware box somewhere in the attic. Let's go and get it and find out what it's like. So we got it out, and oh my God, the smell was indescribable.
Oh God.
It was basically rotting marzipan.
Oh no.
And I think the cake bit was basically okay, but I suspect if you're going to do this, I think this tradition probably sprang up in a time when people would expect to have their first child within a year of getting married, rather than like 5 years later like we did, and then forget about it. And so you're probably not really meant to keep it that long. But
that's a fantastic anecdote.
I suspect you're probably meant to take the marzipan off before keeping it, because I think that's probably the weak point. The icing is probably fine. And the cake is probably okay. Yeah.
Was that possibly to do with the fact that it was like fully sealed and possibly a tiny bit damp?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably due to our own shoddy collection care skills at home as well, but...
Shame on you, of course, you should be.
Anyway, we didn't eat it, we just quietly disposed of it, and I'm sure all kinds of ill fortune is going to befall our family as a result, and it'll just all be hideous, but yeah. So I'd also love to hear if anybody has successfully kept the top tier of their wedding cake and eaten it, and whether it was better. Rich fruitcake's
what
mature.
Happened to you afterwards?
Yeah,
you okay?
Possibly nobody's going to reply because they're all dead. But
oh, that got really dark.
Amazing. Oh no, I wasn't even aware. I thought people just kind of kept a slice to kind of be symbolic of something or something, but no, I didn't know that you kept such a large proportion of the. I suppose it's the smallest tier, but even so,
yeah. If you have a giant cake and not very many guests, it'd be all right.
Yeah, not quite. Okay, that's fascinating.
My experience of food in collections was a couple of different things. I've only really been responsible for deciding or providing advice on a couple of occasions, and currently. Castle Museum that I volunteered in a few years ago. One week I came into the museum and the collections manager said, "Oh, can you have a look at this box? We went into the store and there was this smell." Oh, you instantly think, shit. I don't want to deal with whatever it is that smells.
Oh.
And it was a box of confectionery chocolate bar type things in amongst other food items, wrapped food items like crisps and little cake bar type things that were only probably, I'd say, under 30 years old. Mm-hmm. And there was definitely a very sort of strange, sweet, slightly orangey smell coming off of it. And some of the wrappers had burst just a bit. And it was basically just, there were food items. They'd been stored perfectly well. They were nicely packed up and stuff, but they were in a damp store. So that was the point that I did some research on what do you do with food items? And I asked some advice from a previous employer and who also had food items to deal with, and that's why I thought to contact them. And basically, my question was, how do you properly store food items? And the reply was, why do you want to keep them?
Well, first of all, there's a valid question.
Yeah.
Because I feel like quite a lot of the time, these things it's representative packaging, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
yeah, exactly.
It's an iconic tin, or it's a special type of jar, and the label's really important. Mm-hmm. But the actual contents is less so. But when it was accessioned, it wasn't necessarily then.
The nuance wasn't considered.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm not saying empty out all your jars either, because there could be some scientific value probably to keeping something, mm-hmm. but it does pose an interesting conundrum further down the line.
Yeah. No, my current thing is a lollipop.
Oh,
that is obviously going sticky and leaking everywhere. Because it's not being stored in dry conditions. So I'm of two minds when it comes to this sort of thing of, I believe that everything is fine as long as you store it correctly, but some of that storage might be freezing it, which is difficult to maintain reliably, or, just the standard silica gel packing.
I did read that some museums do have like a dedicated fridge, for example, for their food collection items and that sort of thing, just to keep them at a lower temperature than everything else. So it's just, kind of a corner of the store with a fridge plugged in. Yeah. Which is an interesting notion. I've also heard people do that with cellulose nitrate, for example, because they can't have a dedicated room, but they can have a fridge. But, it's one of those things.
Difficult for display, though.
Yes.
To go back to why museums might want to keep the things, I guess they may have some research value. And I'm thinking of some of the very sort of ancient archaeological food remains that there are in museums, and things like the wheat grains that they found in ancient Egyptian tombs, which enable archaeologists to find out a lot about the species of wheat that was grown and quite a lot about diet and that kind of thing.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think there's somebody once made some beer from some barley grains that had come from, I'm not sure if they can really have come from an Egyptian tomb. That sounds quite dubious, doesn't it? But anyway, when you're not just kind of making novelty beers, then I think there probably is also a legitimate research interest for keeping these things. But that's not obviously why a lot of museums do keep them, I guess.
In fact, there was an interesting article in History Today a couple of months ago, and that was all about mummy wheat. So wheat that had been found in tombs was sold at a ridiculously high price, of course, because it was believed that they were somehow infused with extra power, and that grain that grew in ancient Egyptian times was extra special. So people tried all over the world to grow this from these few grains. And of course nobody was successful, but or I think maybe one person was or something. But it was a really fascinating article, and it's ludicrous the amount of stuff that basically charlatans. It's not necessarily even from a tomb. It's just that it's the selling power of mummy wheat and growing something super special as a rich person with far too much time and botanical interest, which is ludicrous. But it was a really interesting article. And if I can dig something up, I'll put it in the show notes, but I'm not sure if I can find that sort of thing because it's not a paid magazine.
But there's a big difference in the different types of food, isn't there? Because you've got your dry goods that were sort of either have dried and that's why they've survived, or they are fairly dry things like bread, like, you know, a dry toast or a biscuit or something. So the ethnographic museums like the Pitt Rivers and the Horniman have food in their collection.
And also they have actual, did you read about these, the cheese figures?
Yes.
And the bread figures.
That's what, so...
No, what?
Post.
Yes, genuinely actual figures made out of cheese
I believe
bread.
it's
Oh, wow.
July the 18th, 2013.
Bungalinken.
Horniman, yes, thank you. Horniman blog post about the food in their collections. And it's very interesting. It reminded
also kind
me
of beautiful, like
beautiful. Yeah,
you know,
really
it's like proper
lovely.
sculpture, food sculpture.
Really cute, and cute little chicken thing as well. Sorry to catch you while you're drinking that.
I was drinking some tea then. Excellent timing.
And it reminded me of the Pitt Rivers, their sorts of food-based collections, and it's, you know, scone, biscuits, that sort of thing, stuff that's supposed to be dry. So you've got that stuff. In my mind, you've also got the stuff that's sort of designed to keep, like astronaut food and space food.
Something freeze-dried, for example.
Yeah, it's freeze-dried or it's been packaged. So the whole idea is that it lasts hundreds of, lasts forever and ever and ever. That's another type.
That's kind of the case with the sugar ornaments that I mentioned. Like the reason they've lasted 100 years is that it's like, it is pure sugar. It's not sticky.
Yeah.
It's just kind of a solid form. And it's kind of dry as well. And it's super hard.
Yeah.
So it kind of lends itself to being preserved.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there's the stuff that is packaged. And the stuff that's packaged, the freshish stuff that's packaged, that's the stuff that worries me, because it's like the chocolate bars in wrappers, or the frightening ones like beer in glass bottles or cans or something, because that's the kind of stuff that will internally deteriorate and then cause some poor conservator somewhere a hideous mess, like the one you discovered.
And even,
I'd actually love to hear
that one
stories.
was thankfully relatively localized. You know, it was within the box. Everything else could be wiped off.
Yeah.
Oh, the smell.
If you have any fun, this is what I discovered, food-related stories, please write in, because I'd love to have horror stories told. But there's lots of different places we can find information. There was actually an icon workshop earlier in this year, in February, in Switzerland. The Cans project, of basically cans containing food and what to do about it, basically.
If anyone went to that, we'd love to hear from you.
Yes, that would be really interesting. If anyone has any notes or comments or reviews from that would be great.
Yeah, or photos or anything.
The conservation of modern art literature as well might have some interesting bits and pieces. I haven't been able to find much publication of conservation of food, you know, that you can buy from Amazon or anything like that.
It's probably seen as a bit niche, even though
it is
actually everywhere.
Yeah, but I think modern art literature, that sort of thing, because occasionally you get sculptures out of bread and stuff again.
That's a bit like how that artwork out of meat that Sophie mentioned a few episodes ago, where it exists only as a set of instructions now.
Yes, that's, yeah.
The thing is, a lot of the food that you get, I mean, it's just materials. So materially, it's not going to be that different from other things that you might encounter in museums anyway, I would have thought. You know, you were saying bread, but that's essentially just carbohydrates and I guess a bit of water and whatever else there is in bread, proteins and whatever. But I mean, is it fundamentally that different from, I don't know, like paper?
I suppose it's the enzyme content, fats and moisture.
In some ways, I suppose it's just being risk aware, just like we're aware with pests with anything, much like you'd keep a fur in a really kind of clean environment, you'd have to do the same with food, because again, it's a source of food for other things, not just us. Not that we'd nibble on a bread sculpture.
So I suppose, pests are obviously one of the big topics really here.
Yeah, and obviously biohazards like mould.
Can I fit in first, because it's relevant to what we were just saying about a study of material study of foodstuffs.
Yeah, go for it.
Quickly before we talk about pests, because I feel like this is a different section of the topic. There is actually a really interesting study done by Emily Hamilton in 2011. I get the impression it's a sort of dissertation thesis type thing, but we'll put it in the show notes, called The Analysis and Treatment of Food Artifacts, Sugar Paste Wedding Cake Topper, and President Grover Cleveland's Wedding Cake. And it is a materials analysis and literature review of food, and specifically cake, and deterioration of those materials, why they deteriorate, what's causing them to deteriorate, depending on whether it's cooked, and that sort of thing. And then the case studies with different treatment, trials for treatment, and then the results of treatment. And I found that very interesting in terms of how to approach conserving cake, particularly. And it was, as I said, a piece of wedding cake, relevant to our earlier example. And shall we have a guess at the consolidant that's best used for consolidating wedding cake, and the kind of consolidant you could have used for your wedding cake, Christina?
It's going to be parallel.
It is parallel.
Do you want it to remain edible or not? I suppose is one of the questions.
No, I want it unappealing.
In which case, I would have thought something like wheat starch would be. Not that would work very well as a consolidant, but it would remain
Jenny's
edible.
guess was right. It was paraloid. I think she caught the expression on my face of, yeah, you get.
Would that not massively affect the? Because wedding cake is quite porous.
I was going to say, you're going to end up with like a solid matte slab. Like, it's going to be...
I think, I don't...
Is it not going to saturate it and change the colour a lot and make it quite plasticky looking?
Colour change might be relatively subtle depending on what you use.
Yeah, for some of the examples, they use different solvents, different concentrations. So I think for the cake it was a 5% in ethanol. But again, I would encourage anyone interested, I would encourage you to read the full study, because I did only skim through it as I wonder what they used kind of thing, and have full time to do a proper appraisal of the whole thing. But I
can't believe you described it as a literature review about cake. That is one of the coolest publications I've ever heard. Just have to say.
I don't know if I used the correct phrase, but it was a sort of study of what is cake and what does it do. Basically lipids and enzymes and what they do and why they're problematic to us and that sort of thing. And the use of glass microballoons and all sorts of different solvents. Barrier layers, which I found particularly interesting as well. So I thought that was good to read as a study, because there's lots of different things to consider. So yeah, that was interesting.
Do you know, that's made me think, one of the problems really when approaching the conservation of food items is knowing what your end point is. What are you aiming for?
Yeah.
So a lot of the time, the ways that we could prolong the life of food radically change the appearance of that food. So you might be able to preserve cake by letting it dry out. That's obviously a good way to stop it from going mouldy, is just let it kind of naturally desiccate a bit and essentially go stale. And if you do that slowly enough, then eventually cake does just go completely dry, but then it's got quite a different texture. It doesn't really look like cake anymore, and so on. So I suppose consolidating it with B72 likewise is a good way of preserving its integrity, but does that change its appearance quite a lot so that it no longer looks like cake as you would understand cake? Or do we just have to accept that food items are incredibly difficult to preserve and some kind of change in their physical properties is going to be inevitable?
I think probably the latter. I'd say the latter, to be honest, because it's one of these, you want it to survive, but it's almost impossible, basically. It's just going to deteriorate. I think the first example I heard of this was a friend. He was given a piece of wedding cake. Again, wedding cake is everywhere. Just eat it, guys. I mean, at your wedding, don't eat your collection. That's disgusting. And he was given this piece of wedding cake, and he basically his response to the person who'd given to him to conserve it is, all I can do to this is pack it full of consolidant. It's going to change the qualities. I can literally just make it a slab. But that's, if that's all you can do, that's all you can do. And you've still got the shape. In theory, you could still extract material from it to do any sort of chemical analysis. But I don't know, if somebody presented you with like a strawberry.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, okay, so... Yeah,
so you can preserve that by freeze drying it. I mean, they freeze dry strawberries and you can get them in breakfast cereal and whatever. And those you can keep those for a very, very long time.
True.
But it no longer looks like a fresh strawberry.
Could you shove peg into it, do you think?
Oh,
ew!
I feel like it would degrade quicker. Oh, you mean after freeze drying?
No, I mean, okay, so I'm
just replace all the water in the strawberry with peg.
Yeah, this is what I'm saying. I know this is probably one of those situations where this kind of thing you say among friends only, and then if you, for example, announce it to a wider profession publicly, people will instantly go, what? Of course you can't, for all of these proper reasons that you should know about. So I'm just going to ignore all of that and say, I wonder if you could replace the water as you would with waterlogged wood.
Waterlogged, yeah.
Could you do that and then freeze dry it? Would that work?
I have a friend who works for a large archaeological trust that does quite a lot of the peg treatments in this country, and I can ask her if she would mind slipping a strawberry into the peg tank. But perhaps
maybe we should
next
start
summer when
with
they're in season.
Less water. Yeah. Maybe we should start with less water dependent fruits. But then I don't even know. Maybe it's better if something has more water in it. I feel like we're going off topic.
Okay, brain it back.
I feel like we're directly on topic. Yeah.
Pests.
Yeah, pests.
Obviously,
that's the problem. It's bad.
Obviously, we're going to worry about that.
Yeah, but then everything moulds. Jesus,
I
feel defeated by the whole problem. No. I probably shouldn't say
Okay, have a sip of tea. It's going to be okay. But is there any value? Okay, so I guess because we already talked about archaeological food stuff and that there's immense value in looking at the DNA and all that stuff just to figure out what kind of strains of wheat and all that stuff, like what people used. So should we be aiming to keep stuff for the same reason? So people know what pickling was like in the 1950s, and so people know what chocolate was like in the 1800s. I mean, is that why we keep them?
I think keeping some 1950s British food as a sort of cautionary tale to make sure that our cuisine never goes like that again would be quite a good idea. I think food is really important because we all eat food, and it gives us a very kind of direct window into other cultures.
It is very relatable.
You can imagine that culture so much more easily if you know what they ate and what it looked like, and ideally what it smells like and what it tastes like. But that's one of the problems with food in museums, is that literally you just look at it, and even that might not be very useful if it's changed tremendously in appearance. I guess food is kind of a working object in that sense, in that it only really makes sense if you're eating it. But that's not a very helpful line of thought for food in museums.
You have the museum you're currently working in has a working kitchen, doesn't it? So that brings a totally different... Yeah. I've been thinking of this very much the food in museum collections way, but there's actually our interaction with, as museums, our interactions with food, or as conservators, our interactions with food within the museums is going to be something we all have to deal with at some point.
Yeah, no, it's true. So we have a working Victorian kitchen with a nice range of stuff that is regularly used the way you would use it. And people make food on it, the kind of food that you would have in Victorian times, for example. So it's very much showing people what food and cooking was like back then, and then people get to actually try it. So, it is all perfectly edible and encourage for people to come and join in and try it. Yeah, so that's kind of living history, really. And again, that's making food relatable, I guess. But again, it's just to kind of make this clear, it's a museum, and in the center of the museum, there is a kitchen that is a working kitchen preparing hot food. But they're in a kind of almost a reenactment way. Although, I mean, the food's real. But, it's, again, it's kind of more of a living food heritage kind of thing.
So do you think that's more kind of appropriate or more useful even in museums than the kind of dead food that we deal with as conservators?
I think so. I think it's so much more relatable than seeing a tin in a glass case. To actually be able to come and see someone make some food and then have a taste of it if you want to. I think that's actually I think it's a really good alternative, basically. Not that everyone has a working Victorian kitchen.
No, but actually that sort of made me think of another way that museums have food, and that's museum cafés.
Yeah.
Which we all love to hate.
The spider diagram. I've just turned over
I was going to say,
pattern.
what even makes a good one, by the way?
On my in museums spider diagram, there is cafes in big writing and in capital letters, crisps! ! Exclamation mark!
How come?
I mean, I went slightly off topic here, talking of the cafes in terms of food within museums and the proximity to collections.
No, but that's also important.
Yeah, well, yes. Particularly as it's something that is so important to the way that museums are now. But also,
I guess it's an important income stream for a lot of museums, so they have cafes, sometimes even restaurants.
Yeah, and in the same way, hiring out the spaces for external events.
Yeah.
And having internal exhibition openings and stuff where people are carrying crisps around.
I'm more concerned about the wine. I'm going to be honest with you.
That's true, yeah.
I'm more concerned about that side of things. I feel like people can hoover a bit extra afterwards.
I went to an Icon Archaeology Group Christmas party about 10 years ago where people were invited to share their greatest conservation cock-ups, either anonymously or if you're feeling brave enough in person.
I think we need a feature like that on the show.
Oh, yeah. Amazing.
We can put another form on the website so you can do it anonymously. But one of these people was a very senior conservator who was at a drinks reception in an actual gallery and managed to stumble and throw an entire glass of red wine up the wall in the gallery.
Did it hit anything?
I don't know.
Wow.
But that's one of the reasons why having these things in museum galleries is not necessarily a great idea. But then I've been for a 3-course dinner in a museum gallery before, which felt really wrong.
Whoa. Okay, I've not seen that done, but certainly nibbles and light food, maybe sandwiches, that sort of thing. Okay, so I guess this is coming down to food policies in museums and stuff like that, and looking at where people are allowed to eat and under what circumstances you might change that. So events are obviously one where a bit of leeway is needed.
You can't tell people not to eat and what to eat and stuff.
Well, it's also common sense in some ways, because obviously if you need the income stream from the special events, then you can risk assess, is it worth having food and drink in this gallery? For example, yes, if we do extra cleaning afterwards, or yes, but only if it's not red wine, only white wine, so there's less staining risk.
Yes, and there's nothing on open display.
Yeah, so I guess it's more, we're coming back to risk assessments there, where it's, as a conservator, you should ideally have some input into that so that you can say, we can be in this gallery, but we definitely can't be in that gallery because of these reasons. So could we just block that one off whilst the event is on, for example, that sort of thing. It's interesting when it's everyday use and telling visitors that you have to eat in designated areas. That can be an interesting one. Sometimes not met with delight, I shall have to say. People do like eating just out of convenience. And let's be fair, we all get peckish, but please, can you eat your crisps in the cafe? Please.
I think the trouble is, though, I've been, because I've got small children, the museums I've been in recently tend to be the kind of ones that seek to attract families with small children, in fact. And two I've been to recently are London's Transport Museum and the National Railway Museum. And both of them have a cafe or an eating area where you can eat your sandwiches, whatever. But it is literally just an area in the main exhibition space. And it's not very clearly demarcated. It's just kind of, you sit up this end of the thing and eat your sandwiches here. Here are some tables and chairs and whatever. But there's not a very kind of clear transition from the it's okay to eat here, but it's not okay to eat here by this bus kind of
that's interesting
area. And I think that does it. I mean, generally people did seem to be being quite sensible and just eating in the eating area. But it's not like it was kind of roped off or barriered off or whatever. They were just kind of relying on people wanting to do the right thing and understanding that it's okay to eat your crisps here but not here 10 metres away. And you were literally in the middle of the sort of gallery areas as well, so it did kind of feel a bit weird eating
that is a bit weird,
your lunch while surrounded by objects. But I guess that's a pragmatic.
When I've seen that done, it's been a very separate room, or like you go through this door and then it's okay to eat. I've not seen it done like in a gallery space.
No, they're definitely, I mean, these are very, very large gallery spaces. So in Transport Museum, it's essentially the entire gallery space. And I mean, I guess they also are taking the view that maybe large transport objects are not as vulnerable in the same way. I don't know. Again, there would have been an element of risk assessment there.
Yeah. But I guess it's kind of important to say that because it's in that particular hall, it kind of has closed carriages around it. You can go into some bits of it, but not everything. So it's not like it's a traditional exhibition space. It's more of an experience space where it's kind of all a bit interactive and stuff. So it is, I guess, marginally different from the really traditional eating amongst the display cases, which I think would be a bit weirder.
Also, you've not
except that the things in display cases are in display cases, so are arguably less vulnerable.
Yeah, it's true. It's kind of funny like that, but I'd still feel super uncomfortable.
I think I'm less uncomfortable if you avoid things that make crumbs and things that splash, but then also
good luck with that in a museum cafe.
I know.
What would you propose we eat? Celery or
only bananas?
God, I don't know. I don't think I'd ever propose that anyone ever eats celery.
Unless it's an ingredient, in which case it's tasty. All right, fine.
We're having braised celery for dinner. I like celery.
Oh, well, I mean,
each to their own.
All right,
each their own.
But actually, okay, so what would you be okay with people eating in a museum space?
I was just about to ask you that question.
I mean, the trouble is a lot of the things they sell are the very kind of carby and therefore attractive to pests kind of things, like muffins. Sandwiches and cakes and muffins and crisps.
So what's
and
the context? Is this in a cafe or, say, at a high-income generating event like a wedding? I feel like if you have a high-income generating event, then the extra expense of cleaning can be spent.
So let them eat cake.
By
the way, on the topic of cake, just a really, really quick thing. Again, I'm going to put this in the show notes. Did you know that there's at least one museum that makes Mondrian cake?
That's such a good reaction.
Modern art desserts, and this is genuinely a thing. Oh my god! All of your faces. This is great. I'm popping a link in. Yeah, genuinely Mondrian cake.
Oh my god.
It's a slice of Mondrian.
That is so cool.
To Google this immediately.
Is it like Mondrian sort of? Is it like a sort of square cake where the top of it looks like a Mondrian painting, or is it like a Battenberg cake where you cut slices and each slice?
It's basically Battenberg but Mondrian.
That's so cool.
Oh my god! Yes, I'm so glad I introduced you to something new. It's amazing.
Oh my god!
It comes from a book called something like Modern Art Desserts as well. I mean, it's served in museum shops, but it's from a book. If I can get hold of the book, I may squeeze it in as a bonus review or something, just because it's really hilarious. But anyway, that was just a kind of a side note that, hey, some museums serve Mondrian cake. Carry on.
That's amazing.
I can't even remember what we're talking about.
Well, okay, so we talked about...
We were saying that we would let people have cake if they were paying us a load of money to have a wedding there, but the museum cafe people can only eat celery and bananas, I think.
Okay, so now you put it like that, it sounds extremely unethical.
But, I mean, as you said earlier, the museum cafes often bring in a lot of money.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of deal, in a way, isn't it? Is that we accept the extra risk and the extra housekeeping work and so on in exchange for the money, because people are more likely to stay longer, and museum cafes are all horrifically expensive, so presumably they're making massive fat profits. I don't know. I've seen one of the nicest things I've seen is at a National Trust property near me, where they had a blackboard up that told you how many scones they'd sold in the last year, I think it was, and how much money that raised for conservation of the house.
That's amazing.
And therefore kind of like making a direct link between people eating scones in the cafe and things being preserved in the house, which I thought was
I
quite
like
nice.
that.
That is nice. But okay, so we've talked about visitors eating food. How about the people working in the building eating food?
You could see my lips
so
purse.
the reason I bring this up is that there's actually a survey from 2014 called basically about food in museums, done by the Society for the Preservation of Natural History Collections in America. It was answered by 351 museums in 21 countries, and it asked all sorts of questions about having food in museums. Over half of the respondents said they don't have any written guidelines for food in their institutions. So that's about 60% of people had no guidelines whatsoever. And the 40% who did say they had some said they weren't updated, they weren't really used. So again, not a stellar start. What types of food service do you have in your institution? Respondents, well, basically special event food was a big deal. People also had built-in cafes and restaurants, like we already mentioned. Other people had snack bars, coffee carts with food that's prepared off-site, or vending machines, which I thought was quite cute. I don't think I've ever seen a vending machine in a museum, probably because I haven't really been in a large enough
Not one that wasn't part of the collection.
Yes, quite. But nearly 5% said they allow food in galleries on a normal basis, but 48.6% said they allow it during special events. So there again we have this thing that it's permissible under special circumstances, like an opening night or a wedding and that sort of thing. 2.6% allow food in collection storage areas, and 5.1% allow them in labs. I thought that was a bit interesting. So all labs I've ever been to have a no food policy, where you leave the room if you need to eat something, but you can have a bottle of water that is sealed, so it's not likely to tip over and splash over things.
It's a health and safety thing as well, though, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's for your own protection.
Yeah.
Yes, no, quite. So I found that a bit interesting, and the fact that some people eat in food collection, in storage areas, worried me a little bit. I guess it does depend on what sort of storage area it is, because I can say that your store is off-site, it's in the middle of woodland, and it's raining heavily outside. I can see you having a cheeky sandwich in the door, peering out.
Yeah.
I can see that.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying it's necessarily okay, but I can see it because sometimes these things are built without any facilities for staff whatsoever. Let's not pretend that doesn't happen.
I think I've probably eaten a cereal bar at the door of an industrial store before.
Yeah, that sort of thing,
shivering.
right? Because sometimes it's impossible. Not to mention, well, harsh on anyone who's diabetic and needs to eat regularly.
Oof, yeah.
I think also if your store just contained rusting archaeological ironwork, for example, then you're unlikely to attract any pests that would do any damage to the collection. But if you're in an archive,
that's different,
then that is quite different. So
people said that it's a shared deal between custodians and staff when it comes to cleaning responsibilities. Let's see. They also asked what methods are used to ensure the food remains only in allowable areas. Mostly staff intervention followed by signage. So again, please don't eat in here, that sort of thing. Don't bring an ice cream in, that sort of thing, right? They also asked, have collections been affected directly by food or beverages? 16.9% said that they had some trouble. Spills onto collections or pedestals, pest infestations like cockroaches, mice and fruit flies, condiments and food splashing onto objects, that sort of thing. But that's a relatively low number, which reassures me.
I'm surprised at how low that is.
So I live in hope that when these special events take place, people are on the best behaviour, and it's genuine accidents that kind of end up.
It also occurs to me that with the percentages of, yes, it's allowed under special circumstances, that seems to me that the interaction was, we asked conservation, is it okay to have an event where we serve all these foods, and conservation goes, is there any chance we could not? And then the high ups go, nope, it's happening. All right then, says the conservator, and that's.
I feel like that's probably a lot of the time.
Yeah, I'll just have to do extra checks, kind of thing, because it's the reality of fundraising.
Yeah. And I mean, it also becomes a problem in museums that are very short on space. So not everyone has a nice food hall or area where people can go and have like a little picnic. So what do you do when there's a huge school group in who's there all day and they need to eat their lunch? You can't drive them out into the museum garden in the rain. You can't do that. So do you allow them to have a tidy lunch in the gallery on this one-off occasion, which happens to be all the time? Or because you can't put 80 school children in the cafe, because the cafe probably doesn't have capacity for that on top of regular customers, for example. So it's one of those things that I suspect happens on the sly every now and then, because it's the humane thing to do. But I still have mixed feelings. But anyway, the main issues identified in the survey was basically lack of official food policies, staff issues. The biggest issue experienced was lack of any decent break or lunchroom facilities, even to store food, not just to consume it. So if there isn't a staff fridge, what do you do? Or if there isn't a special cupboard, well, where do you go? Now, bringing up an example from my museum, we do have a staff room. It's tiny. It does not fit all the people, which means that people do tend to eat at their desks. Now, the desks aren't in the collections, but certainly adjacent to some of the stores. So because they're forced to, there's not enough space, and nobody's gonna bolt on a bit onto the nice historical building just so we can have a bit more space to eat our sandwiches. That's not going to happen. So people are sometimes forced to eat at their desks and that sort of thing. But I'm fortunate enough to have a desk, so I don't have to bring it into the lab. Not that I would, but but I have the option of the desk at least, which is something. But yeah, like we said, off-site storage facilities might not even have that. Might be lucky to have a loo sometimes, for goodness sake. Location of vendor food was another thing that came up. Respondents mentioned that often vendor food is not provided in a purpose-built space, but simply crammed into existing exhibition spaces or public areas. So, for example, a hot dog stand or a coffee stand, just kind of in a corner, which again generates the kind of food debris that is quite likely to attract pests.
Food debris and sticky fingers.
Yeah. And then other than that, special events, that can be a kind of a risk thing. Yeah, so this is actually an excellent survey. It is from 2014, but I would assume that a lot of it is very much still relevant. And I'll pop a link to that in the show notes. I just wanted to throw in that I quite liked researching this episode because the amount of museums of food there are in the world, it made me quite happy. There's the Museum of Food and Drink in New York. There used to be a British Museum of Food that's now closed.
Really?
Yeah. Aww. It was kind of a special project, and it didn't end up having a permanent home, so it's gone now.
That's a shame.
The Spam Museum in Minnesota. There's a Frites Museum in Belgium, Ramen Museum in Japan, Kimchi Museum in Korea, Currywurst Museum in Germany. There's some sort of salt museum in Denmark. And basically, there's a wonderful Wikipedia list of food and beverage museums, which we'll put in the show notes. But what amused me most was that if you scroll all the way to the bottom and it's under C also, there's a separate list of chocolate museums. And I'm like, okay, I can see that. And then underneath that, there was a list of potato museums. I'm like, who needs that specific list of museums?
Cool.
There are 14 potato museums in 7 different countries, by the way. That's your trivia for the day.
Thanks very much.
There is also, or at least there used to be, last time I looked, there was an online-only museum called the Carrot Museum.
Oh, yes.
Oh,
I didn't
excellent.
click on that link. What's it like?
It's about carrots.
It's all carrots.
I mean, what more do you want?
I don't know. I'm not sure what I expect.
I'll see if I can find a link to it. I found it while looking for carrot recipes. And
excellent.
I certainly found carrot recipes and much more. So maybe we could put a link to that in the show notes as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's everything from us on the topic of food. Stay tuned for a book review or two. Today I'm reviewing a highly topical publication called Food in Museums from 2016, edited by Nina Levent and Irina Di Mihalache, I probably pronounced that wrong, and published by Bloomsbury Academic. I'm reviewing the ebook version of this, so I shan't comment on the physical aspects of the book, but I can tell you about its contents, and let's face it, that's what we're all here for. This book is split into 5 sections, each dishing out a different take on the subject of food. Part 1 is an interdisciplinary menu. The papers concern anthropology, child development, neuroscience, art, food photography, and of course cooking. This is very much a starter to get you thinking and questioning before we get started on the main course in Part 2, which is about collecting and exhibiting food. As a collection-centred museum professional, this is very much the section that really grabbed me. In Part 2, we get tasters of successful food exhibitions, think famous chefs and cookbook authors, but also various types of food heritage. The ones that spring to mind are, there was some stuff about Latino food in America, and also Native American food production. We also get familiar with the notion of dedicated food museums, which aren't just about collecting, but also about producing and enjoying food. We also explore related themes such as hunger, trade, and ultimately bioengineering. Part 3 focuses on audience engagement, food festivals to celebrate the heritage of cooking, the resurrection of ancient recipes for people to try, and ways of showing people how people have dined through the ages. Part 4 focuses on eating. Restaurants and cafes are certainly covered, but we also take what feels like a slight detour into how food is presented on plates and how chefs can feel inspired by art. These are fair enough, I suppose, it's just not my cup of proverbial tea. For dessert, we've got food and art in Part 5. Here we explore paintings of food, edible artworks, and the role of alcohol in the creative process. Much of this publication is plenty inspiring, and I have no doubt that it has a broad appeal with its many different angles and case studies. It offers nothing specifically for conservators, but I'd recommend giving it a read if you enjoy museology in general, particularly interpretation and audience engagement. I think a resounding message throughout this publication has been that food is an experience. It isn't about jars and tins and storage, but about recipes, smells, tastes, and memories. Like all things in museums, food objects need narrative, and without it, the artifacts are just empty calories. Overall, I found this book quite an appetizing read. Even the more academic papers were easy to digest, and the texts are peppered with puns way worse than mine, which means that you will definitely crack a smile or two as you read on. This book has 384 pages and is available to buy from Bloomsbury directly. You can find it on Amazon and stuff like that as well. From the publisher, the hardback version costs £63 at the moment, and the paperback comes out in May next year, which will cost more like £26. You can also find it on places like Amazon, etc., and I will pop a link to that in the show notes.
Dear Jane, I've just started studying for a Masters in Object Conservation, but I'm not sure what specialism I want to focus on. What advice could you give to a student that finds all materials fascinating, but worries to have a focused portfolio of work for when they graduate? Sincerely, M.
Dear M, thanks for your inquiry. It's good to see that you're already planning your career in conservation at the beginning of your master's degree, and you're beginning to think about what specialism you might like to have. One of the things I suggest that you do is close your eyes and imagine yourself as a conservator. Look around the lab. What kind of lab is it? Is it big and white and shiny with empty desks and analytical equipment? Is it full of bits and pieces, bits of wood and tools? What do you see around you? Who are your colleagues? These sort of things might help you imagine your future career. But don't worry too much at this stage about specialising. As a student of objects conservation, what you should really be focusing on is what skills and tasks you can develop through a range of objects. If you get allocated a ceramic with a break, then you're not only learning how to repair ceramics and reading Bison Oakley, you're also learning about adhesive selection and choice and application techniques. And those skills will apply for almost every conservation task that you undertake. If you were allocated a social history item with some metal threads on it, then there's a whole range of analytical work that you might want to do to understand the threads, what they're coated with, and then choose very careful techniques to ensure that you clean the metals without damaging the underlying textile. As you grow as a conservator, for each task that you undertake, at the end of the task, reflect on what you've learned. Reflect not just on what materials you've worked on, but what skills, what techniques, and what theories you've developed in the course of your project. Those skills and theories will translate across a huge range of object conservation and beyond, and they should help you whatever you decide to do, whenever you decide to specialise. In my experience, you're quite early in your career, and it might be the case that even if you thought now that you definitely wanted to be a metals conservator, by the end of your degree you might find that in fact what you really want to be is a natural science conservator. I hope as part of your degree you will have a work experience placement, and I'm sure this will help you make up your mind as well. So what I would say to you now is don't panic. Yes, you definitely do want to bring up a focused portfolio, but listen to the earlier podcast where conservators discuss what they look for portfolio when they do interviews, and what you'll hear is not I'm looking for a particular material type. What you hear is that they're looking for conservators who can think through problems, who can diagnose conservation problems and come up with solutions, that they can problematize. They can say, in this context I would do this, but in this situation I would change my adhesive because of the lighting in the case or where it was going to travel or the weight of the object. And so your ability to understand a range of parameters around your conservation decisions is really what's going to get you the job. And just to finish really, I love the idea of specialising. You've joined a profession of a few tens of thousands of people, and yet as a group we talk about specialisms within ourselves. Really, in the big wide world, as conservators we're already pretty specialised, so don't worry too much about being any more. You've come a long way from the wide world to find yourself in conservation. You're pretty specialist, you're pretty niche already. Just work hard at the course, get as much from your experience as you can, get out there, volunteer and do placements, and I'm sure a specialism will find you. Over and out.
Bonus review. You know how I talked about that Mondrian cake earlier? Well, I got myself a copy of that book too. This is Modern Art Desserts. Recipes for cakes, cookies, confections, and frozen treats, based on iconic works of art, by Caitlin Freeman, published in 2013. So just to be clear, this is a cookbook. It's got a lovely introduction about the author's journey to make art into cake, her work at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, which is where her cafe is based, and a whole chapter on the ingredients and equipment that she favours. But really, this is a book about cakes. And also, very nicely, the art that inspired them. I actually love that she talks us through her inspirations and simultaneously makes me hungry and more erudite about contemporary art. It's something I know shamefully little about. The recipes are thorough and descriptive, so that a non-professional pastry chef can make these edible artworks for themselves. Measurements are provided both in imperial and in metric, which I really appreciate as a European. The photos also really help in a way that I wish, frankly, that more conservation articles did. While I haven't tried making these beauties yet, I have to say that my favourites from the book would be, well, other than the Mondrian cake, obviously, would be the Liechtenstein cake, the Kudler s'mores, and the Woodman cheese and crackers. This book contains 35 recipes, of which 29 are arty ones, if I counted that right. It has 216 pages, and it's a really fun book for anyone who loves art, baking, or both. I got mine secondhand, but you can find this book in all sorts of places. On Amazon in the UK, it's currently about 20 quid for the hardcover version new. You can also get the Kindle edition if you don't mind getting batter on your Kindle, and then it's $10.99. If you're in America, you can get it straight from the Blue Bottle Coffee store, in which case it's $25, presumably plus shipping, but don't quote me on that. We'll pop some links in the show notes. This would probably make a great gift for someone who's really into this sort of thing. Yeah, it's just a really fun book, and I thought I'd share. And now for some comments, questions and corrections. As always, we love hearing from you, so please do email us or tweet us or let us know that you have thoughts. We love hearing from you. This time we've had a couple of people share food policies, which is very in line with this episode. Now, unfortunately, we already recorded this episode by the time we got these submissions, so it's more likely that we'll talk about them in a future episode. But we just want you to know that we received it. We'd love to see more examples, so do send them in if you want to share. Just so you know, you're not forgotten about. We just can't discuss it in this episode. Thanks for listening. We're the C Word, and you've been listening to Christina Rosaic, Chloe Rumsey, and me, Jenny Mathiasen. Join us next time for an episode about how to conference. In the meantime, check out our website at thecword.show, tweet us at thecwordpodcast, or simply email us on thecwordpodcast@gmail.com. The intro and outro music is Spring by Didi Music, used under a Creative Commons Attribution License. Additional music and sound effects by Callum Robertson. This has been a Wooden Dice production.